My name is Hanne Myklebost Nordengen. I live in Norway and I just finished my master thesis this spring at the University of Oslo. Today I'm going to present my thesis for you. My title for the study is called Affective Responses to Music Listening Before, During and After the COVID-19 Lockdown and an Experience Sampling Study. I'm going to present this by first giving you an introduction to the background. Afterwards, I'm going to present the aims and hypothesis. I then present a method for this study. I will then give you an overview of the main results before I end the presentation by a small discussion where I include weaknesses and strengths, and then the conclusion and implications. And at the end, you can see the references I have used. On the 12th of March 2020, the Norwegian government chose to shut down large part of the society in Norway due to the COVID-19 pandemic, and strict social guidelines were set with the encouragement to be as much as possible at home and avoid other people to prevent infection. This is said to be the most intrusive measures that have been introduced in Norway in peacetime. The measures affected people's everyday life in many ways, both physically and mentally. These consequences of the shutdown therefore provide a unique opportunity to understand how social distancing and isolation affect people's moods and emotion in everyday life. This also concerns music listening. Music listening in everyday life is individual and culturally conditioned, and emotion music brings out in everyday life have similarities and depend on the interaction between the music, the listener, and the situation people are in. In an everyday life with social distancing, home office and minimizing social contact, it is likely that music would play a greater role for the listener than otherwise. Listening to music is an activity which is usually done on your own in parallel with other repetitive activities. And music can also help the activity be less boring. The aim for this study was to explore how the COVID-19 pandemic affected people's listening behavior and the emotion they experience when listening. I focused on the factors listening, the music, and the situation as a decisive for which emotional reactions that are invoked by listening to music. And this made me think of, could we compare what emotions we are feeling under the lockdown and compare it with before and after the lockdown? So by this, I made 4 hypotheses. The first one is that the informants I will use will report an increased experience of nostalgia when they listen to music during the national lockdown compared to before and after. And this was made because we know that nostalgia can function as a psychological resource and is often triggered in difficult periods of life, even during the closure of the spring of 2020. The next 2 hypotheses were made since we know that social distancing changes everyday patterns. It could also create psychological stress, and we know that musical emotional reactions are formed in the interplay between the listener, the situation, and the music. And therefore, the second hypothesis is that the music the informant listened to will be of a different mood and give a different pleasure during the national lockdown compared to before and after. And the third one is that the informant's musical and non-musical emotion will be different during the national lockdown compared to before and after. The last hypothesis is made because we know that the interplay between the listener, music, and situation is strongly linked, and that the emotional outcome of listening to music also can change based on personality traits of the listener and changing the situation the listener is in. And therefore, the fourth and last personality trait is that the personality trait openness to experience and extroversion will be related to positive emotion, increased nostalgia, and musical mood and pleasure, and the personality trait emotionality will be related to negative emotions and lower musical mood and pleasure during the national lockdown. So my method, this, as you can understand now, is an empirical study and also an exploratory study. And by using music experience sampling method, data was sampled during 3 separate time periods, before, under, and after the COVID-19 lockdown in Norway. The informants was a total 31, and there were students at Toneheim Folkehøgskole and musicology students at the Norwegian University of Science and Technology and the University of Oslo. I chose to use music students because of their similar age, enthusiasm and interest in music, and also their living patterns, which you can then assume were similar because of their schedule and day-to-day life. And this would be really relevant for the study. We also know that musical trained people often have a strong connection to the personality trait openness to experience, and also have stronger and more intense emotion towards music. Each sampling periods were based on 1 week, during which the participant used a mobile experience sampling app called Myklebost to track their moods, emotion, and situation connected to music listening. The music is made by Will Randall and Saris Sarikalu in 2012, and is an app for Android devices, where the participant gets a notification to answer questions when they are listening to music. I had the opportunity to adapt and create my own questions, both when the participant listened to music, but also when they did not listen to music, they also get notification, and we can also add in independent surveys. One of the surveys I added was a standardized survey, the Hexaco Personality Inventory, and this is used to measure participants' personality traits, to investigate the potential contribution of personality to music use and the emotional effect of music listening. So the first week sampling period took place in January 2020, before any restriction were given in Norway concerning the COVID-19 pandemic. The second sampling period took place in April 2020, during which a nationwide lockdown was imposed in Norway. The last period of data collection was carried out the first week of September, when the society was open, but still affected by the pandemic to a lesser extent. You can see in this picture, I tried to make a map of how this was collected. And you can see this is the question and surveys the participants were asked when they listen to music and not listen. You can see the musical and non-musical questions. And also what they were asked at 0 minutes and also after 5 minutes. So yes. And also you have the surveys here. So to the results. The 3 periods of data sampling were compared using linear mixed modeling. I also did correlation analysis to investigate a relationship between dependent variables. And again, this is the question. This is the variables, and also personality traits. As for the first hypothesis, the result revealed that the intensity of the mixed emotion nostalgia was significantly higher in April than January and September. You can see in this graph. So this was perhaps the most interesting result I got. As for the second hypothesis, the listener's enjoyment of music was significantly higher in September than in April and January. And you can see a musical pleasure and musical mood. This is the pleasure and this is the mood. You can see the mood is quite the same. It's a bit higher in April, but it's not significant. But this was surprising because this is September and the musical pleasure was much higher in September than in April and January. The third and the fourth hypothesis did not give significant results, or that's not quite wrong. But in the third one, that the informant's musical and non-musical emotion will be different during the national shutdown compared to before and after. No, it was not different, but overall there were positive emotion, both in intensity and musical valence, and what kind of emotion they felt when they listened to music. The last one about personality traits. The results gave really varying significant results, but because of the small amount of participants, it was not possible to conclude, and also there were no patterns in what kind of results that were given. So it was not possible to conclude. Discussion and conclusion. Firstly, I wanted to say that this is an exploratory study, and because experience sampling method is a combination of kind of an observing field study and also an experimental study, you can get many third variables you don't know about, which is impossible to track, and you also have no manipulation to follow. We could argue that the manipulation in this study is the pandemic, which is changing the environment and how we live. But since there are so many ways of living and third variables here, we cannot conclude with any causes in this study. We only observe the data we explore. I would also like to mention some of the weaknesses concerning the participant and connected to the Musac app. I actually had over 170 willingly students who did want to participate, but because the app did not work on iPhones and over 70% of the group could not participate. The app also had some troubles and bugs along the way, so this was also a problem, and I unfortunately lost some participants for every collection period, so there are different they're not the same amount of participants for every collection, and this is a great weakness. But even so, there are a lot to be said about a small group such as this, and the result would still be relevant and interesting to look at. And this is mainly because the students were so homogenetic in interest, musical background, and everyday habits, and also their age. And I would just like to mention that this study only focused on music listening and not other musical activities such as musical performance, for instance. The results give further support to the view that personal music listening plays an important role for the emotion and moods experienced in everyday life, and those musical emotions emerge from an interaction between the listener, the situation, and the music. The study concludes that personal music listening was of great importance for the mood and emotion that the informants experienced in everyday life during these periods. In a time of crisis, listening to music seems to have the opportunity to especially trigger nostalgia. This was really interesting. So, since music has opportunities to provide comfort, fulfill social function, and is used as a means of regulating one's own emotion, it is likely that the use of music during national shutdown or lockdown can be an important tool for mastering a new and lonely everyday life. Thank you, and here are my references.